A reading from 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 22 through 26. Prophecy against Eli's household. Now Eli was very old. He heard all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of the meeting. He said to them, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all these people. No, my sons, it is not a good report that I hear from the people of the Lord spreading abroad. If one person sins against another, someone can intercede for the sinner with the Lord. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can make intercession?" But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to kill them. Now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and with the people. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Won't you please be seated and pray with me? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, there's a new phrase that has entered into many of the conversations about religious life. Perhaps you've heard it. The phrase is spiritual, but not religious. You can nod and let me know if you've heard it. Some have and some haven't, but it's quite active in a lot of the reading that I do. I have to confess that when I first heard it, it seemed nonsensical. It seemed like the words were contradictory as they were put together. When I first heard it, it sounded a bit like, I play football, but I'm not on a team. I'm a chef, but I don't cook. I'm married, but I don't really have a spouse. Now, the precise definitions of these words support my evaluation. I turned to the dictionary and got a definition of spiritual. And here it is. Of or relating to a person's spirit, to religion or religious beliefs, having similar values and ideas, related or joined in spirit. The definition of religious: the belief in a god or gods, an organized system of beliefs, ceremonies, and rules used to worship a god or a group of gods, an interest, a belief, or an activity that is very important to the person or group. Now, since the precise definition of those words leave us at that place of contradiction, we'll have to distill the meaning of that statement, spiritual but not religious, from the intention of those who use it. I've had a few chats with folks who identify themselves as spiritual but not religious, and from what I think I hear them saying, I've come across this statement. I think they mean that there are some very positive traits that they admire about communities of faith, positive traits that they want to embrace, even as they reject other parts of communities of faith that they find less admirable. Now, to my knowledge, and if you know of something, you can let me know, but I don't believe that the spiritual but not religious have convened a convention. I don't believe they voted on documents that precisely express their beliefs, their commitments, their passions, and their concerns. This group, the spiritual but not religious, if we were to compare it to politics, it might be better to think of them as a group of independents rather than as an organized third party. But think of them we must. 1 in 5 people in America today would identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. When asked about their engagement and involvement in any of the spiritual communities, they would say, no thank you, none of the above. And that number is growing. It's not decreasing. So think of it, we must. I'd like to spend the next couple of Sundays sharing with you some reflections that I've gleaned from people that I admire as I read their work. The first is Diana Butler Bass. And she believes that what the church must do is listen to the spiritual but not religious. And then Lillian Daniels, she suggests we should argue with them. Now, when you listen to somebody, it doesn't mean that you automatically agree with everything that they say. It only means that you pay attention to the meaning of the words and you do your very best to understand what they say, what they mean. We do our best to appreciate the integrity with which they speak. And to listen to someone, I believe, is to never, ever, ever lose an unconditional, positive regard for their well-being. As a church, we should listen to the spiritual but not religious. They have something to say. And of course, likewise, to argue with someone in the most noble sense of the word is not to try to destroy them, not to try to beat them up and win a debate, but to argue is simply to honestly respond to what we hear and to tell our truth even as we encounter the truth from someone else. Well, in all my listening to the spiritual but not religious, I hear one thing loudly and clearly. The spiritual but not religious have been telling us that being religious without being spiritual is dreary and dangerous. So with that introduction in mind, let us turn to a chapter of Israel's history where spirituality and religion are at play. Amanda read for us the prophecy against Eli's sons. If anyone represents being religious and not spiritual in the Hebrew texts, it would be Eli's sons. Now, this story takes place in the time of Israel before the founding of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not the capital of Israel. The temple has not yet been built. The religious center is located in Shiloh. And the leader of that center is an aging, holy man named Eli. He has 2 sons, and according to the ancient tradition, they were slated to take his job after he died. However, he was ill-suited. They were ill-suited for their calling. You see, Eli's sons knew that Israel had an obligation under law to support them, but they had little interest in fulfilling the spiritual tasks that were assigned to them. They demanded their rights and refused their responsibilities. So that's where we catch them in the prophecy against them. They were sleeping with prostitutes. They were stealing the offering that was brought to Shiloh. Eli's sons were so bad that the ancient text tells us that both Eli and God gave up on them. And Hannah brings a little boy named Samuel to Shiloh, where he lives and studies to take their place. Samuel took the place that was slated for Eli's sons to occupy, and nobody complained. And when Eli's sons die in battle, their deaths are grieved, certainly, but the grief is much more for the disappointment of the way that they lived and conducted themselves. And just after we learn that Eli's sons have died, we learn that old Eli dies of disappointment as well. And one of Eli's sons' wives was pregnant, and she bears a child. And she names her child Ichabod, the word that means the glory of God has departed. What we see here in this beginning of the book of Samuel is the very death of Shiloh itself. That it has been a religious institution with no spiritual engagement. It's been all show and no substance. It's been all pomposity with no power or vitality. I think the spiritual but not religious and the rise of that group in our culture is really a challenge to you and I, not to go the way of Eli's sons. Did I ever tell you about Hank? That's not his real name. Hank was a member of a church I served. And as a part of the outreaching ministry of our church, we 3 or 4 members, including my lovely wife Kathy, would stop by a local housing project where many of the underprivileged children lived, and fill up the car and bring these wonderful people to church. Now, their parents weren't there to help them know how to behave. And so sometimes they were a little challenging. But they loved that. They loved the attention. And most folks in the church were really thrilled, except for Hank. Hank was not too happy. And one day, one of them wore his baseball cap into the sanctuary. And Hank was mad. You could see his face getting red, the steam coming out of his ears. Well, it was a Yankees hat, but no, never mind. And he said, "I'm going to kill him." I said, "Really, Hank? The death penalty for wearing a baseball hat to church?" My heart broke for Hank. We're talking religious with no spirituality at all. That his sense of decorum mattered more than a human life. We're talking religious without being spiritual, aren't we? Hank got so mad. Religious without being spiritual. I think it would be fair and I think it would be accurate to say that ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the jihadists that are stalking our globe are religious without being spiritual. That is, they cling to a sense of law that they would enforce on all those around them. And they kill for that purpose. And in this week, after the events in France, I don't need to tell you how deadly that religiosity without spirituality is. Well, in wake of the rise of the spiritual but not religious, Diana Butler Bass has often been asked by pastors and churches, what should we do? How should we respond to a time in our society when there seem to be those who will take a little bits and pieces of who we are and reinvent them and use them apart from us? And I love what she says. My first response is simple. Maybe we should just listen. Just listen to them. As non-defensively and as fully as we possibly can. Listen with wide open hearts and listen with nimble theological imagination. Instead of criticizing those who already feel victimized or frustrated with church life, perhaps it's time to look more deeply at the churches people are leaving. Maybe the spiritual but not religious are pointing away. Hear this. Maybe the spiritual but not religious are pointing the way toward a different kind of church. A new kind of Christianity. If those of us who still care about old denominations and traditions can receive the criticism of their absence and learn from it, even as it comes with a bit of a sting. Well, what should we do? I don't think it's hard to figure out at all. We should keep spirituality as high on our agenda as we possibly can. It means doing the right and the loving thing all of the time. And it means never allowing the church to devolve into little more than a social club with benefits for members only. That's a good place to start, don't you think? You can say amen. We should keep our eyes on Pope Francis. I don't quite know what he's doing, and I don't quite know how he's doing it. But he seems to have significantly shifted the debate about religion and spirituality. And I admire that. And I think we should stand up and we should cheer for Hassan Nasrallah. He is the Islamic leader who said this week that the behavior of some of these jihadist groups that claim to follow Islam have distorted Islam and the Quran and the Muslim nation far more than Islam's enemies, who have insulted the Prophet with cartoons and films. Sounds to me like the uniting of religion and spirituality. What should we do? Really, nothing different, but to do it differently. We should do the things that we love and that we value here in the life of the church with all of the joy that we can muster, with all of the enthusiasm for the meaning that it gives to us and the blessing it can be for someone else. We must never, ever forget that as we live within this religious structure, that we live as a joyful people who love God and who love in God's name. Well, you know, the gig was up at Shiloh. The whole religious community fell apart. But God did something wonderful and beautiful. A little boy named Samuel heard God calling in the night, and he said yes. And that little boy would anoint David. And King David would rebuild the temple, that not just the religious institution of Israel, but he would rebuild it with prayer and praise and with joy. I believe that if we live our lives with spiritual joy and spiritual hope, that we will be a part of a future even more glorious than we can imagine, because we belong to a God of new birth, of renewal, and love. Amen. Amen. Well, before I give the benediction, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being here, for your songs, for your prayers. Thank you for a day of rich blessing through music and celebration. And now may that peace of God that passes all understanding keep our hearts and our minds in the knowledge and the love of God and of his Son, Jesus Christ. And may the blessing of the one who created us, the one who redeems us, and the one who sustains us, be with us now and always. Amen.